Just leave it.
Sure.
Yeah, we have to get started. Some sure we're going live.
Yeah.
Some sure we're going live.
Okay, it's better.
So that's gone live and the sound's working. Okay, good. Just leave it.
Sure.
Yeah, don't try to get rid of it. Okay, good. Have you shared one? Okay, great. Sorry we're starting a bit late, everybody. We've just got the streaming organised. So, my name's Chris Borden, for those of you who haven't met me before, welcome. We're doing a short course on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. So, first of all, this is my disclaimer. I did my PhD on Zizek, but I've not done any formal study on Hegel at all. So what you're getting is an amateur's attempt to make sense of what's probably one of the most difficult books in the history of Western philosophy. So I'm hoping that we view this as a collective attempt to make sense of a very difficult text. And if I'm saying anything that you think is wrong, please do ask questions and open up discussion. Because, as Hegel believed, it is through our errors that we make progress. So more than happy to be corrected if there's anything I'm saying that you think is not correct. Today, what I'm going to be aiming to do is do some background. So, okay, I'm going to give you some very basic background to Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, and then I give you, I guess, what is a work in progress for me, but my attempt to explain what this text is about as a whole. So, Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel is one of the thinkers that comes at the end of the movement of that's called German idealism. That happens, of course, in Germany at the end of the 18th and 19th centuries. Kant is really the key figure in this movement. And sometimes when people talk about German idealism, what they really mean is just post-Kantian philosophy. But the key three works of Immanuel Kant, Critique of Pure Reason, Critique of Practical Reason, and Critique of the Power of Judgment, are really the three works that all the key thinkers of German idealism are responding to, including Hegel. And the thinkers of German idealism can roughly be divided into the categories of transcendental idealists, and which are Kant and Fichte, and the absolute idealists, which are Schelling and Hegel. In the brackets, I've tried to, in one sentence, explain the basic difference between transcendental idealism and absolute idealism. And the way I describe the difference is basically this. The argument of transcendental idealism is basically to find what are the very conditions of thought. So we have something called reality, but the transcendental idealist would say, yes, but what we see as reality is always conditioned by certain structures of cognition. And so that if we want to understand what reality is, we have to understand what are the very conditions by which that reality is actually being generated through the human, I guess, cognitive apparatus. The absolute idealists, Schelling and Hegel, in some way want to move beyond that by saying they're moving beyond the split between that idea of there being a reality in itself and a reality that's a separate reality that's then thought of as a subject, and they want to say that those categories or those means by which human beings are cognizing reality are actually somehow part of reality itself. So that you can't really make a separation between the subject and the object. That would be my basic definition of absolute idealism. The German idealism, I think this is right. It's being compared to, it's just one of these inexplicable, profound inexplicable flourishing of philosophical activity. If anyone's studying continental philosophy today, it's very difficult to do that without, in some way, coming across Kant and the problems that he threw up. And so for that reason alone, I think it's important to try to consider Hegel. But when it comes to general idealism, Hegel is probably, I think, the most difficult, the most controversial, the most contested, and also one of the most influential thinkers in Western philosophy. He has this dense, obscure style, and which leads his text to being very open to different interpretations. And his texts are just not easily accessible. So if any of you have tried, it's very hard to just pick up Phenomenology of Spirit and just start reading and going, oh yeah, this is great, this is interesting. The thinker, one of the Hegelian scholars, Frederick Bezier, the metaphor he used to describe reading Hegel is chewing gravel, and I think that's probably about right. That being said, also this is my metaphor though. I sort of also see Hegel as like the pinata of Western philosophy. So after Hegel, you can sort of see Western philosophy as all these different attempts just to get beyond Hegel and to show why Hegel's wrong, why the idea of absolute idealism is in some way flawed. Zizek sort of describes Hegel as the basic trauma of Western philosophy. So he's this thinker who causes this catastrophe, and everyone else after that is just trying to deal with this person who claimed to be able to use philosophy to find something called absolute knowing. Okay, so the work that we're looking at is Phenomenology of Spirit. This is the first of Hegel's published works, published in 1807. It's his most influential text when people talk about, like if you walk into a bookstore and you're finding a book on Hegel, it'll be Phenomenology of Spirit. Generally, it's not going to be Science of Logic or any of his encyclopedias, and on logic, mind, and nature. And what was it? And philosophy of right is probably the other more popular one. It's most well known for the master-slave dialectic or the Lord-Wandsman dialectic, even though that's probably only about 4 pages in the book. So, and this is just a strange. I don't know how to describe that's happened, but that concept becomes so important for Western philosophy and so influential, and it's such a small part of this of the text. But for Hegel, this is actually just preparation for all of his other work. So I've got a little diagram here published by John Stewart to sort of show how this text fits in with the rest of his work. And the basic idea of phenomenology of spirit, which can also be translated as phenomenology of mind, is that it charts the journey of consciousness from common sense to science. And science for Hegel is just another word for the means of understanding reality. And he just calls that absolute knowing. So this here, the level of common sense to absolute knowing, That's what phenomenology of spirit is about. And the idea is that when you get to this point, you understand the standpoint of science, and then you're ready to have a look at it, to actually read his works in the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences. So if you want to understand Hegel's system, you actually read the encyclopedias. And then philosophy of right comes down to sort of here. So the other interesting thing about Hegel then is, why is it that when we come to study Hegel, why is it that when we come to study Hegel, the book we're focusing on is just this book that's preparing you to understand the rest of Hegel. And then unless you're a Hegel scholar, this other stuff often isn't even mentioned or read. So in my journey in Hegel, I'm still very much trying to grasp this part of it. And then the next stage would be then moving on to this encyclopedia. So this whole text is just getting you ready to understand the rest of Hegel's system. From going from a level of common sense or natural consciousness to absolute knowledge. Okay, so this talk, I'm going to try to explain background, and then I'm going to go into an introduction. The section on the introduction is going to be just fairly actually going through the text in order, step by step, and just, it's fairly short, so you just basically read the whole thing together. The background is my attempt to make sense of what the argument of phenomenology of spirit as a whole is about. And this is still very much a work in progress, but it should be enough to help orientate us to make sense of the introduction, which will be our goal today for our success criteria for today. So one of the questions, I'm taking it right back to the basics of philosophy. One of the questions that guides philosophy as an activity, so when it comes about, with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, is that it's answering those questions of what do we know and how should we live in a way that is no longer relying on just your cultural background or the religious conventions of your society. So the idea of philosophy is that you could appeal to something like reason to answer those questions of who we are and what is there and what we should do, to move beyond the answer to those questions that are given to you by your cultural and your religious traditions. Okay. In that is the idea that reason has this emancipatory potential. That if we use reason and we use it correctly, we are actually able to answer these fundamental questions of what is in the world and how should we live in the world, how should we organize the world politically, and so on. Now, that vision of rationality, of course, becomes lauded during the Enlightenment era, but during that time as well, it suddenly becomes clear that this idea of using reason to try to answer these questions suddenly seems to start almost like destroying itself or undermining itself. One of the basic questions, so on one hand, the Enlightenment is like, yes, let's use reason to challenge religious tradition, to challenge cultural prejudices. But in effect, the Enlightenment also then comes to question reason itself. What is reason? Is reason actually something that is going to help us free ourselves, or is it actually something that blinds us? So one of the criticisms of Romanticism against the Enlightenment, for instance, is that reason does not give you the whole reality. It will miss out important aspects of reality, things like beauty and love and those sorts of things. A more fundamental question is, why are we assuming, if the project of the Enlightenment is to use reason and science to find the truth, why are we assuming that that's actually good for us? And that's, of course, one of the questions that Nietzsche asks very convincingly. Why assume that this idea that truth is actually something that's going to set us free, or is a Christian prejudice, not necessarily something that we should accept as, it's based on faith, not based on reason itself. So this really comes to the head with David Hume, and Hume's big contribution before Kant, and one of Hume's big contributions to philosophy is that he just situates, he looks at philosophy of reason, and he just situates it as an expression of human nature. So rather than seeing philosophy as something based on something outside of human nature called reason that can justify itself from the ground up, he says, no, what we call what we call reason is actually something about just these natural predispositions that humans have as a part of the world. So this is famously shown in like Hume's problem of induction, and which is basically that for science to get off the ground, for you to make the claim that you know some sort of law of nature because you've repeatedly observed nature doing something, you have to assume there's something called a uniformity of nature in the first place. That is, you have to assume that the way nature's behaved in the past is the same as the way nature's going to behave in the present or in the future. And then if you simply ask the question, how do I know that that uniformity of nature is there? Then the answer is you can't. Because if you try to prove there's a uniformity of nature, so if you try to say, okay, I'm going to posit that, I'm going to claim that there's a uniformity of nature. Okay, what's your argument? How do you know? Well, whatever's happened in the past is always also what's happened in the future. So yes, but if that's your reasoning, that's the very thing you're trying to prove. That's circular reasoning. You can't think outside this idea of a uniformity of nature. But that doesn't mean it's there. You haven't proven it's there. What that means is that the whole, and now, Hume is not saying we shouldn't believe in the uniformity of nature. So his claim is not that, because something's happened in the past, I can't be sure it won't happen in the future. His point is just that you can't rationally justify that. That's just something that we believe because we're animals, and it helps us survive to assume that something that happens in the past is going to happen in the future. In fact, if you didn't believe that, you're not going to last very long as an organism. You know, if you think that, well, this time I touched fire and it was hot and it hurt me, but maybe next time it's different. You're never going to learn your lesson. So his point is not that, we can't believe that. His point is we can't help but believe it. But what you can't do is claim it's rational. It's not rational. It's just part of human nature. He had a very similar view of morality. His view of morality comes to be that we're sort of human animals with emotions. We see violence and it makes us feel horrible. It's like, that's bad. I don't like that. And then to express that emotion, we turn it into like a moral category. And then we just say, that's bad. That's wrong. But really those ideas of wrong and so on are really just these expressions of emotions. So this is an example of Hume of this Enlightenment critique, which says what you've been seeing as reason is actually really just it's not anything particularly special. And I can look at human beings as like these expressions of nature and explain reason that way. Another really crude challenge of Enlightenment reason would just be that when we're reasoning, all we're really doing is using, say, survival techniques that we've learned through because of evolution. That'll be another example of Enlightenment critique of reason, which sort of destroys reason. So what Hume does is something similar. And this is, so what happens is this Enlightenment project leads to skepticism. So when we look at human beings as objects of inquiry, reason becomes merely this expression of natural human behavior. We come to see ourselves as determined by natural forces rather than as autonomous individuals capable of freedom. That, by the way, is a belief that's still very common today. So when you'll see like philosophers on YouTube, and one of the claims I'll make is that, human beings are completely determined. There's no such thing as freedom. Freedom is an illusion. And, or there's also a book I was reading, The Case Against Reality. I forget who wrote it. But his claim is that evolution has conditioned us so that what we see as reality is conditioned by a need for survival rather than the truth. So evolution conditions us to see what is good to survive, but it's not what's really there. We don't see what is really there because that's not how we're conditioned by our evolutionary past. So these sorts of arguments are still made today. And under that view, things like morality and politics just become these expressions of natural behavior rather than something which you could actually improve through some sort of rational activity. Like we're going to step back from this and analyze it rationally and sort of prove it. Because if you're doing that, you're really still just doing the very same thing. You're not really moving beyond nature. You're just another example of, it's just another expression of that natural tendency. So we can read Kant's whole project then as an attempt to rescue reason, but by critiquing it, by putting it in its place, in a sense, by saying that if you accept, so his critique of pure reason is, it basically just says that if you can accept what reason is doing and how reason, where it comes from and how it functions in terms of affecting the way that we view reality, then what we can do is get rid of a lot of illegitimate uses of reason that try to ask questions about things we can never know or understand. Questions like the origins of the universe, was there something before the Big Bang, the questions of the existence of God and so on. But we can also at the same time save some idea of scientific objectivity, so that reason is still going to do its job of actually helping us develop knowledge. So the basic argument of Kant, and the way he moves beyond Hume, is he says that the way in which we perceive reality is determined by these categories of the understanding. Things like, so some examples of the categories of understanding would be things like when I, would be like cause and effect, for instance. That when that whenever I see something, A occurs and then B occurs, and they're connected in some way, I can assume there's some sort of causal effect happening. Another example of a thing that I assume is that when I see an object, what I actually perceive is just a manifold of different sense impressions, but I'll perceive there being some object there, some X, that's holding all those impressions together. Now that's nowhere observable, but it's something that my cognition just does when I perceive that as an object. So then what Kant would say then is that, well, we can't get to things as they are in themselves. So I can't get to the noumenal world, the in itself. What I can say is that because all of reality and all of our cognition is always conditioned by these transcendental conditions for cognition, these categories of understanding, that we can nevertheless have a shared knowledge. It's completely possible. The only thing you can't do is take those conditions of understanding and apply them to things that we could never perceive, that we could never experience. And when you try to do that, what happens is you end up with these antinomies of reason. And because you'll find that you can justify, you can find a perfectly logical, reasonable argument for why there must be an infinite regress when it comes to that things have always existed. And you can develop a just as reasonable, convincing argument that no, there must be an initial starting point. There must be a prime mover. And both of them are legitimate and logically coherent when you apply the categories of reason to them. And what that shows is just that our categories of reason, our categories of understanding, if we just apply them to things and they're just running on their own, they will lead to, and they're not actually connected to anything that we can sense. They just lead they'll lead us to develop completely contradictory understandings of the world. And he also comes up with a really interesting idea of morality based purely on reason. And this is something that the Phenomenology of Spirit Hegel comes back to, is very critical of. But Kant comes to see that as rational creatures, we have this capacity to act morally in the world according to the moral law. The moral law is just following the maxim such that the categorical imperative, so whenever I act in a certain way, I have to act in such a way that I could wish that I could have this maxim for every person. I could also say that I would want every person to act in the same way that I am. And immoral behavior is just is when you act according to is when you act in such a way that goes against those absolute categorical imperatives. So for Kant, reason does actually give you an explanation for the difference between right and wrong. And it is based on these rules of reason. Problems with Kant. Okay, so this is where Hegel starts to come in. So first of all, yes, he saved scientific knowledge by making a distinction between the phenomenal and the nominal. So the phenomenal is what I can understand based on the categories of understanding. And the nominal is just what the world is in itself when it hasn't yet, which of course we can never perceive or never understand, but you just have to posit that it's there. So yes, he saved knowledge, but in a way he did it by saying that knowledge is impossible. Is what? Yeah, he said that. He saved knowledge, but said that there's also the things that we'll never understand. He also divorced the realms of the theoretical and the practical. So knowledge that we can develop using the categories of the understanding, and which is just our knowledge of the way things are in the world, just doesn't explain the practical. It's completely divorced from the categorical imperative. I'm just going to elaborate on that a little bit more. So, according to Kant, when we act morally, one of the things that we posit is that we have free will. Now, we will never see that free will in the world from our theoretical understanding. So that if I see and someone commit an unethical act, like let's say someone comes in and steals that pen, and then they claim, yeah, but I was just determined. I didn't choose that at all. I'm just completely determined by my reality. From a theoretical scientific perspective, Kant would say, yes, you're never going to see anything in reality that indicates that person made a choice, okay? But when we reason practically, because we have this idea of the moral law, we posit that we act freely, and we posit that we actually do have this free will to either follow the moral law or to fail in following the moral law. And for Kant, that theoretical knowledge doesn't prove that we don't have free will because it's limited. When we look at the world, we're only seeing things according to those categories of understanding. It just doesn't allow us to see that free will. When we reason practically, we reason in a different realm. And in that realm, everyone is free. As moral creatures, we choose whether or not we commit certain actions. So for Kant, the reality of morality is what causes us to posit that we must be free. It's not that, so the moral, in a way, the reality of the moral law is what legitimizes our idea that we're free. And the fact that we're never going to see that in the theoretical realm, that we're never going to, say, through science, be able to observe someone making a free decision, just is fine for Kant, because it's like, yeah, but that's just not what theoretical understanding is worried about. Theoretical understanding is worried about what's there, it's limited in what it can see. Whereas practical understanding is very different. It's like, how should I act in the world as this autonomous moral creature? And you can see then that you have that split between, he doesn't really then overcome the problem of determinism. What he'll say is that if you look at the world from a theoretical perspective, yes, everything's determined. That's just one of our categories of understanding. We can't help but think that way. But if you look at that world and you want to reason practically, and you want to ask that question, what should I do? Well, then you have to posit that you're free. And those two things just don't go together. But they don't have to. They're just two different ways. I don't know if lens is the right word. They're two different ways in which we can approach having knowledge about the world. Okay. So, Hegel's project. So Hegel's aim in the Phenomenology of Spirit, but really his project as a whole is, and this is from Robert Stern, whose book on the Phenomenology of Spirit is very good, is to help us see that the world is rational by getting us to look at it in the right way. For Hegel holds the world is rational, and the goal of human inquiry is to bring this rationality to consciousness. That is to become aware of this rationality and hence achieve a fully adequate comprehension of reality. And you can see how that's different from Kant. For Kant, the world is rational. It has to be just because that's the categories of our understanding. For Hegel, no, the world really is rational, and I can show you how it's rational if you just come to look at it in the right way. And so, through reason, in Hegel's terms, we can find the world is not only knowable, but also that our reason manifests in the world as a force of freedom would be its ultimate vision. So, and here's how I'd sort of, a helpful way of reframing how you see reason. When Hegel talks about reason, he's not only just talking about the way in which human beings think, he's talking about humanity's tendency as a historical force to turn the world into something that's knowable and inhabitable. So reason is a force that works through the world to turn it into something that is no longer alienating to us. So the world is no longer this horrible, alienating other. Yes. And Hegel's idea is very enlightenment project, right? The world is rational. The actual is rational and the rational is actual. You just have to look at, understand reason in the world in the right way to see that. And one of the things that stops us from seeing that is a tendency to separate the subject and the object. Key things at this stage, though, is it's all tied up with this idea of freedom. So a key, really important idea for Hegel is that it's through there's a teleology in reason that leads towards freedom, ultimately. So this is from Hegel's Lectures on Fine Arts. The ignorant man is not free because what confronts him is an alien world, something outside of him and in the offing on which he depends, without his having made this foreign world for himself, and therefore without being at home in it by himself as in something his own. The impulse of curiosity, the pressure for knowledge, from the lowest level up to the highest rung of philosophical insight arises only from the struggle to cancel this situation of unfreedom and to make the world one's own in one's ideas and thought. So on the surface, it does sound crazy, but it's when someone says to you that reason is that the world is actually rational, your initial spontaneous reaction that it's probably going to be, no, it's not. It doesn't make any sense. So much of it is stupid. How can you say it's rational? And Hegel's argument is that when you're saying that the world isn't rational, you're being too limited in how you see reason. You're seeing reason as this thing that's only in our heads, and you're not seeing it as something that's actually in the world at the time. That's how I'd put it. So this is probably a terrible example, but again, I always have to remind myself that through mistakes and through bad examples, and understanding why they're wrong, we can make progress. By understanding at this point, though, it would be something like the very fact that this is happening, so that we have something like this room and someone explicating ideas out the front to people who are also, listening and grappling with that. That whole activity happening here is an expression of reason. Why is it happening? It's happening because there's a tendency in the world that's not just in our heads, it's out here, happening now, for human beings to not be limited, to want to be free. And that's the ultimate reason why this is actually happening, from Hegel's perspective. So the reason isn't, the other example I like is that, this is probably a difficult example to understand, but it's one that really struck me as I was reading the book for the first time. When there's a really annoying road, to Wong, when you're coming up on this bridge, and the cars always get banked up when they come up on the bridge, and there's another road that leads into this lane that's always banked back. And so what happens is, these cars could never get in if people follow the actual law. So what happens is every morning, people just spontaneously go, okay, one car goes, and I go, and then another car goes from that lane, and you go. So for Hegel, that's an example of reason, operating in the world. It's human beings working together to make what is horrible and alienating, something unalienable. So the world stops being something that's frustrating to, this is nice. Yeah, that's a very simple, naive kind of explanation of how Hegel sees reason. Okay. So key differences. Hegel attempts to overcome, so for Hegel, his whole project is really trying to overcome the split between the phenomenal and the noumenal. The phenomenal, which is how the world is for human beings versus, or how it is pointed out through the categories of understanding. The noumenal being the thing itself. And the path to absolute knowing, at the end of Phenomenology of Spirit, basically is overcoming the split between subject and object. So, the absolute involves seeing the monistic truth of the subject-object identity, which again sounds nonsensical. Oh, sorry, not nonsensical. It does sound fairly. It's a very radical claim. The point is that we can think and see the world in a way where we no longer see subject and object as opposed to each other, but they're actually part of together in a unity, and a monistic unity. So we're no longer seeing the world as separated into how the world is in itself and then how it is to human beings. And that's the progress from common sense understanding. This is what in the introduction Hegel called common sense understanding. So that's the idea that there's me and my understanding of the world, and then there's this other separated, alienating, unknown, separated part of the world, to a scientific understanding, which Hegel defines as where there's no longer a subject-object dualism, and where the object as it is in itself is identical to our notion of the object. And when you see the word notion, the way I've come to think of this word notion as it's used by Hegel is think of not just an individual's concept of something, but something like a worldview, like how a culture or a system of thought views something, and you've got that broader idea of the notion. Okay. So this is his definition of absolute knowledge from the science of logic. So absolute knowledge is the truth of all the modes of consciousness, because as the course of phenomenology brought out, it is only an absolute knowledge that the separation of the subject matter from the certainty of itself is completely resolved. Truth has become equal to certainty, and this certainty to truth. Pure science has presupposed the liberation from the opposition of consciousness. And I guess that means a liberation from the idea that consciousness is something separate from the thing that is understanding. It contains thought insofar as this thought is equally the fact as it is in itself, or the fact in itself so far as this is equally pure thought. What we perceive when we're understanding something, part of what that object is how we're understanding, how I unpack that. As science, truth is self-consciousness as it develops itself and has a shape of itself. So that which exists in and for itself is a conscious concept, and the concept as such is that which exists in and for itself. There's that great Hegelian style shining through. Yeah. So the basic takeaway, though, is that that's the end point we want to get to at the end of the Phenomenology of Spirit. So that's still very confusing for me as well. And again, my initial thought is it's just impossible. The way that I see the point, though, is something like this. Or maybe I should keep going, but the point would be that you can't separate what an object is from the way in which human beings think about objects, would be the simple way of putting it. I think that'll make more sense though once we work through the introduction. So I'm just going to keep going.
I just thought I'd make a quick comment.
Yes.
In this quotation, because it's the Cambridge translation.
Yes.
The concept is the same as notion, as you mentioned before, but that's an A.B. Miller, because it's Begriff.
Okay.
But A.B. Miller translates Begriff as notion.
Okay.
Here, I think it's translated as concept. So just so everyone's able to follow that.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Yep. So concept and notion are the same in.
Yeah, I think in the Cambridge editions they translate it as concept, which I think is more accurate.
Okay.
But A.B. Miller.
Okay. Great. Okay. So the categories. So now I'm just going to go through some basic distinctions between Kant and Hegel, which will again I think help orientate us in the introduction. So Kant provides this really static account of the categories. So the categories are a priori, they're just necessary conditions for any perception of understanding of reality. And they're fixed categories of intuition. So they're because they're a priori, they're just eternal and unchanging. They're ahistorical, they're not cultural, they're just necessary conditions. Whereas for Hegel, the categories are determined by social and historical processes. And this is a quote from John Stewart's summary of Phenomenology of Spirit. So for Hegel, human representations are not ultimately determined by fixed categories and forms of intuition, but rather are continually molded and reshaped in something that resembles a historical process. Kant's epistemology can be seen metaphorically as a one-dimensional or horizontal account of human knowledge, since for him the form of human representations is eternally and ahistorically fixed and cannot change. Hegel's phenomenology, on the other hand, is a multi-dimensional vertical account of human knowing, which examines not just one set of categories or one conception of objectivity, but rather several. So, whereas for Kant, so a couple of things. One, you can read the Phenomenology of Spirit as also engaging some sort of transcendental project. It's also asking the question of what are these necessary conditions for us to have an understanding of anything. But where it's different is that whereas for Kant, you have these categories of the understanding, which is there. For Hegel, he wants to show how these categories of understanding are actually emerge through time and through history. So they don't just come in terms of being as just being something static. I found that difference really useful as well. So the idea that for Kant, the account is almost like vertical. There's almost like a progress of developing different categories, different stages of consciousness through time. Whereas for Kant, it's like no, they're just an ahistorical reality. They're fixed. There's also differences in how they see the subject and the object. So for Kant, the cognitive faculties that determine the object are fixed by the subject's mind. And so in Kantian philosophy, you do get the idea that the subject is, in a way, the source of reality and the object. Whereas for Hegel, the conceptions of the object work themselves out according to an inner logic, for which the subject is a necessary, non-sufficient condition. So for Hegel, the object and in a way, probably not this right, the logic of the object, the way that thought works itself out through the dialectic, is something that isn't really reliant on the subject. It's almost like the inner logic of the concept itself working its way through the subject. So it's not so much, so you no longer have the idea of this, there's a world and there's a subject that's now, that's creating a reality of the world. Rather, the reality of the concept is the way in which the subject and the object are in this dialectical relationship and struggle, which is, and that's, which of course is sort of like how the truth is happening. Yes. So the idea there is then, and again, you see that collapse of it's not just that there's a subject that's using these categories to then create reality. It's that the reality is the way the subject and the object are in a dialectical relationship. Also for Hegel, as our accounts of the objects change, you don't have an unchanging subject. So as the consciousness of phenomenology of spirit develops, it doesn't just change its understanding of the world. As the understanding of the world changes, the understanding of the subject itself also changes. So you don't have a static subject. The two, the understandings of the subject change as objects do. So our understanding of the object, the subject, and the criteria by which we use to determine the truth are all actually intertwined with each other, related to each other. They can't be separated. Yes. And this is just another point I found helpful in helping me grasp Hegel's project. A real shifting idea of what mind is. So whereas we know that mind, when it's used by Descartes, he talks about the mind as a thinking substance as opposed to material substance. So mind is something other than the stuff of the world. And also because of the way that the whole Cartesian project of doubting occurs, you get this idea of the mind being something that's almost like inherently eternal and secret, that that no one can access my mind and so on. And likewise for Kant, you actually have a similar conception of mind, where the mind is this subject that's applying the categories of the world to make an understanding of the world. Whereas for the Hegel, the mind is something out there in the world. So the mind is not what's happening in here. The mind is what is being collectively produced by all of us. The mind is not something, and as I said, yeah, so with this idea of freedom, it's then what is expressed as civilizations work through history to make the world something knowable and safe. That's how you get the idea of mind. Okay, massive work in progress. I don't think this is right. This is my understanding of how the different sections of phenomenology of spirit work together at the moment, and how then it builds on the Kantian categories. So this is the basic structure of the phenomenology of spirit. Very, very basic, right? So once you've got through the introduction, you have consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit, religion, and absolute knowledge. And if I was going to sum up the argument of the book, it's basically that you start with consciousness. So you start with this knowledge that I just want to know the objects of the world, forget about this subject, forget about culture, put that on the side, I just want to know objects. And at the end of the consciousness section, you realize you actually can't talk about objects without a subject. You have to have a subject. Okay, then you get self-consciousness, which is all about subjectivity. I'm a subject, and so is there a subject? So I want the whole world just to conform to me. At the end of that self-consciousness section, what you get to is a realization that you actually can't have a subject without intersubjectivity. There is no subject without other subjects. Then you move on to reason. Reason is then this attempt to, okay, now that I know I can't have a subject without other subjects, I'm going to try to grasp the world as using universal knowledge. I want a universal knowledge of the world that everyone can share. But when you try to do that, what you realize is that, yeah, but you can't generate this universal absent knowledge because there's no such thing as a universal. Those ideas of reason are always situated in history or culture. They work themselves out temporally. So then you move on to the phenomenology, the spirit, which then traces sort of a similar thing through in terms of history and culture. And you can sort of see how at each level that the category is getting more complicated. Like you start by saying, I just want to know what subjectivity is there. Yeah, but then to do that, you have to think subjectively. Okay, I'll put the subject in as well. Okay, but now you need more than one subject. You have intersubjectivity. Now I'm going to develop universal reason then, a knowledge that everyone can share. But there isn't any such thing as a universal reason. You need because those things are always worked out in particular cultural and historical contexts. So then you need spirit, and you're thinking through spirit. And what started with this really simple thing of I just want to understand what this is, turns into, whoa. You've got to take all these things into account to be able to answer that question. And then religion, this is the way I describe it, it's something like religion is then how these cultures perceive the absolute for themselves. And so you need to consider that. And then you finally get to the absolute knowing, which is where the object and its notion coincide. The basic argument being, getting to absolute knowing is realizing that the knowledge of our knowledge of the object is always going to be mediated by caught up with all these other parts of the reality of the world. Okay. So when we reach absolute knowing, we realize, I think I've already said this, So we can't separate how we think reality from reality. How we grasp reality is always a part of that reality. We learn that philosophy can show us how reason works through the world to make the world a place which is no longer alienating and which can be seen as knowable. And the categories of knowledge that we use to grasp the world are themselves ultimately ontologically grounded. So, and that's sort of what we demonstrated in science of logic. So there isn't, there is a reason why those Kantian categories are the way that they are, basically. And it's grounded in, it's not because there's something separate from the world, it's because they're very grounded in being itself, which is not separate from thought. Okay, a few words on, I might actually, with 15 minutes in, so I might just pause there and just ask if there are any questions or if any points of comments that people would like to make or anything like that. And we might have a break for 10 minutes. Yes?
Could you go into a bit more depth about what notion is? Because I remember like the first time I read it, I really struggled with understanding what he was talking about when he kept saying notion. Like, what is that term referring to?
So you know how you have I've written explanations just yesterday in Stuart, and he said something like, you know, when you think of how, like not a personal idea of something, but something like how like a worldview would view something, or how a particular like discipline of knowledge would view something. So the notion wouldn't, so like the notion of an atom wouldn't be what you think an atom is. It would actually be how the scientific community is conceptualizing that atom as it does its work. Right. So the shift for me was, don't just think of a mental representation, think of a like a concrete, socially accepted understanding of something. Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. So in the book is like the notion of these things kind of changing as you go from like reason to spirit. Like, is that kind of what's happening in the book of how we understand?
Well, yeah, but it depends what the notion's of, right? So
Yeah.
you'd have a notion, yeah, but definitely the notion of, say, what an object is would definitely change as you move through.
Yeah.
So just a simple example, if you start with the notion of the very first stage of consciousness, you start with the notion of the table as, oh, it's just out there as a thing that's completely separate from my understanding. Then in trying to just think through that, you come to the realization that no, actually, I can't think of that object without some sort of categories of thought. I have to be there, and there has to be some thinking happening for that to even be to be there. So that'd be an example of the notion then of an object changing. Yeah. I think.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Okay. Yep.
So the first question, so there's one essential thing I'm trying to confirm, and then there's a couple of implications from that, and I just want to see whether or not that's accurate according to your understanding of Hegel.
Yeah.
So the first one is that there are distinct stages of ontological development of consciousness, and they are hierarchical. And by hierarchical, I mean the one level transcends the other, whilst it transcends it, yet contains what is valuable from the lower level.
Yeah.
And then the second thing I would want to ask is, so then would each level of knowing have its own or represent a sub-philosophy with its own particular ethics and epistemology and aesthetics, etc., etc.?
Okay, so I think the answer to the second part is no. You definitely can't see the different stages of consciousness as different philosophies or different philosophical systems. Rather, you should see them as a way in which a consciousness could understand itself and its place in the world and the object and so on. Yeah. Your point about being hierarchical, though, is I think correct. So the idea is that and we're going to get to that in like soon. But a key point is really emphasizing instruction as well. A key point for Hegel is that the phenomenology of spirit, you can see it as a massive skeptical exercise. Like it's taking. Imagine we look at the world this way. Oh look, that's wrong. But Hegel says, but rather than just saying that, oh, we just get rid of that negation. He says no, but that negative result is actually part of the positive result. So part of the truth for Hegel is you have to follow the process of getting to the truth, and you can't just start in the way with the end product. Yeah. So you definitely have the idea of hierarchy, which is similar to the idea of what and it goes. I should have done it the other way around because Stuart talks about being that vertical understanding of the categories, and it really like starts there and sort of builds up. But that's just important they come in the book. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm a bit uncertain about the categories because I know about them roughly from the logic, and I was under the impression that in the logic Hegel was trying to work out a more robust, Kantian version of the categories. And I'm just confused how the categories come up here because there was the quote about like all the different sets of categories at different times.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's the go with that? Is the idea that in the phenomenology we're dealing with like all these categories that come in and out, but in the logic, like in the actual system, then Hegel works out his categories.
So my understanding is that you're right. In science of logic, he's sort of showing how where the Kantian categories come from and why they're right. But in the phenomenology of spirit, it's misleading to say that when Stuart makes a comment that the categories change, he's not saying the Kantian categories change. What he means is that the ways in which the subject is perceiving the world and the logic they're using to perceive the world, that's what's changing through time. So I can see why it's being misleading. So the earlier statement about the categories changing through the phenomenology of spirit, that's not Kantian categories. The ones that Kant wrote, but they're the structures that are being used by that consciousness to grasp the world, if that makes sense. So, yeah. So, for instance, the first consciousness, I don't think it tries to avoid the category of saying I'm positing an object out there. So it's trying to say, oh no, I'm going to pretend that there isn't an object out there. That it's just pure sense perception. It's just what's there. It's manifesting. So I think does that help?
No,
clear it
that
up?
helps a lot.
Yeah. I think that's where but thank you for asking that question because that was confusing.
Could you also relate the divergent methodologies just to the titles? I mean, like the phenomenology is using a phenomenological analysis. Like it's starting with immediate consciousness and then like actually going through the stages of this development. Whereas he's assuming that there's no presuppositions in the logic and then just trying to deduce the categories from there. Like he's laying them out there. Whereas this is like a phenomenological analysis.
Yeah, and sorry, that's really helpful. And so in a phenomenological analysis, then it's actually you're describing different experiences of consciousness. Like you're following through consciousness through these different experiences. Whereas in science of logic, as you said, it's like you're just saying, let's presuppose nothing and develop the Kantian categories.
Yeah, I think a bit closer. Because he couldn't even presuppose immediate consciousness. Because there wouldn't even be a justification to begin with that from a presuppositionist.
Yeah. Okay. We'll break for 10 minutes now just so everyone has a bit of a brain break and then we'll keep going. Talking about dialogue.
Next weekend as well. Yeah, and then I started second slide. Yes, I mean, after this, I'm another 3 hours. How are you? Yeah, good. I drank. Have you been, Jamie? Is it a break?
Yeah.
Yeah, we want to give one. I love it. Yeah, it's nice. But might be good. Yeah. Other places. I'm not gonna get nice there. New agents, so it's like a country place. Yeah. And I was and just say shit. No, I know I'm like, that it is. Well, it's not around. And that's the on their competitors. I'm not going to go open. I'm not the best. It's quite big. I'm not going to do it. No, I know they just wouldn't. And I didn't turn yeah. It's been neglected. Wow, did you was it like the surprise of this? Actually, yeah. This turned out that way.
So did you do anything like honors as well? I did, yeah, I did like for, well, because I graduated halfway through the year, and so my honors only begins, it'll begin this year, so I had 6 months to go. So I didn't have honors training. Just killed the words. So can you only do, like, are you going to go back to, like I just did, I go back to yeah, I mean, just to do like, yeah, part of that, yeah, and also like, yeah, do anything 6 months before, and it was nice, and then, like, yeah, it is yes, before it came out, I can imagine contributions. Yeah, because I was like, I don't know, like I definitely couldn't survive research. I was like, I remember I was sitting in office, just like every 5 minutes, I'm like, just the amount of stress. Yeah. And so these like, not nice. Yeah. Well, that's doing cards majoring in math. Oh, I'm doing bachelor of math and the jewelry arts. Yeah, cool. Yeah. So I'm a bit like torn on which way to go. Yeah. So I was just wondering if you can do like a honors in math or something else. Yeah. Are you doing like just the base, or you're doing like exams? Just the base. Yeah. So there's no like job with like honors attached. Yeah. Yeah, it's annoying. Yeah, you definitely can do such. Just you do like I don't think you can do them at the same time. Yeah. You have to do one after the other. But yeah. The only problem is it's like once you complete honors, it's kind of like you're ready to jump further into it. I mean, the ideal thing is to combine all these one. So that's kind of what I try to do. Jumping on this like history of mathematics. Yeah. You can do that, I guess, in a math. If you did like logic, mathematical logic, you can do that. You can also do kind of pedagogy related stuff if you're interested in that. Yes. You'd have to find the right supervisor and stuff. Yeah. And like Guillermo was my supervisor. Who was Guillermo? Oh, Guillermo, yeah. No, and we kind of use philosophy, logical. And so, like, how long have you been a tutor? Yeah, 2 years. And then this is my first time. Oh, yeah. Just intro. 2010, 20. So I'm going into my third year. It's a 4 years. Yeah, 4 degrees. Next year as well. And so that's why I'm trying to like take a bunch of math courses this year to kind of decide if I think there's something I want to like do honors in, or if I want to do philosophy. It's just is that like a part of math? I guess you're math. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Abstract algebra is when I yeah, well, 2 through was like my favorite course I've taken. I mean, I honestly like I studied 3 through 3.
and I felt like I didn't like anything to do around. Like I actually don't remember what I liked.
Yeah.
So like, it's just
That's
so
not good. Give that.
Do you have
that'll be a lot of fun. Everyone
Yeah.
I just know it's gonna be intense.
Yeah.
Yes. He does like he does really hard assessments, but it's very nice. Like
Yeah.
there's this one question I remember. I think in before I watched several minutes. And I was like, I'm definitely gonna zero. Yes, sure. Give me all the 10 dollars.
Oh, that's,
So it's very nice. The question.
I had all one for 241.
Oh yeah, I heard.
And
Yeah.
yeah. Which was really funny because a bunch of the assignment questions were like number theory questions in this sense in an analysis class. And we're just like,
numbers don't lie.
yeah, exactly.
No, I just like never touched on there. I
Yeah.
just know it's
Yeah. But the way I heard, it's like the difference between them and like assessments is my Sid will give like the hardest questions on his quizzes, but you'll know for sure what they're gonna be on.
Yeah.
Whereas Ola will, the questions won't be hard, but he'll be really vague in like what he's actually gonna be assessing. Like he gave us 3 topics, like our first week, and only one of the topics was on, but actually because he gave us 2 other things. I just felt like, oh,
he's really chill with the idea of just because it's an oral interview
right.
and the questions are literally like you just memorize the clusters
Mm.
and he'll just ask you to do groups and stuff like that and ask you definitions. It's very
Okay. Did he do third year?
I did third year for sure. That was really and I did fourth year. Advanced was
Yeah.
we did that like French and modules. We did that with him and
Yes.
Yang.
Yeah. Because I've been, so I think that'd be really cool, because I've been reading his textbook, we'll go through why, but it's a complex analysis textbook, but it's, the latter half sort of goes into like the analytical theory bit. And so
Okay, we'll keep going.
it would be really interesting.
So now I'm going to attempt to explain what we mean by the Hegelian dialectic or dialectical thinking, which is the basic methodology of the phenomenology of spirit. Now, obviously, this is quite a complex and controversial. Like defining a dialectic is quite difficult. So this is obviously going to be very simplistic. And be interested to hear how other people would define it. So dialectical thinking, basically human thought tends to see the world in oppositions, and dialectical thought allows us to move beyond those divisions to see the whole, how the identity of anything relies on its non-identity, or So again, just moving so it's a form of immanent critique. So it doesn't start from axioms or foundational beliefs. It rather works through how a position contradicts itself based on its own premises or starting point. So dialectical thought, and this is one of the things that makes it such an important part of Hegel's project, is that it doesn't, as a form of critique, it doesn't have its own starting points in a way. It just takes whatever form of consciousness you have and then says, okay, you've got this form of consciousness with these assumptions. Now let's just assume that's the case, but just work through it and see what happens. And then the dialectic shows how then these different forms of consciousness contradict themselves, and then through that contradiction, they have to move on to a different form of consciousness. So dialectical thinking is like a philosophical therapy in the Wittgensteinian sense, but unlike Wittgenstein, the point of Wittgenstein's philosophical therapy was to get you to see that there's no point in philosophy, right? How philosophy is just based on these misuses of language. Whereas for Hegel, no, the point of this dialectical therapy is actually part of the cure. It does make progress. It's not just a purely negative thing. So how would you prove that dialectical thought works? If you really want to challenge that, like prove to me this dialectical thought works, you can't really, I don't think you could develop an argument for it, or you would, because that would actually itself involve setting up oppositions, which would then be dialectically torn apart. Rather, you just have to show that you have some position that doesn't rely on oppositions, or you'd have to show that you have some that there's some position that isn't that couldn't be dialectically, which wasn't able to be critiqued dialectically. And that's just a quote from Stern. Hegel sees the role of philosophy is to lead ordinary consciousness away from oppositional thinking of the understanding in order to overcome the kind of conceptual tensions that make the world appear less than fully intelligible to us. And once this is achieved, we will overcome the intellectual and that should be practical difficulties that have arisen because we do not look at the world rationally, at which point the world will look back at us in a rational manner. So again, that's the goal of dialectical critique that we get in the phenomenology of spirit, to get the idea of reason being something actual in the world. In Encyclopedia of Logic, these are the 3 stages of dialectical thinking. This isn't the only way in which scholars though understand dialectical thinking. In a presentation I was at recently at the ASCP, the person there really he did a whole presentation on dialectic and just argued it really was this negative, that at the heart of dialectical thinking is just this negative gesture of pulling away from something or questioning something. So it's that as the basis of the motor of the dialectic. But if we just take this as one definition provided by Hegel of dialectic, these are the 3 stages. So the abstract side is you break things up and you separate things. So that's that you create these oppositions. You have a negative side, which he also calls like the dialectical aspect of it, where you realize that abstraction from a multitude of things that you cannot really understand, and where you sort of basically question that opposition. And then a speculative side, which in some way apprehends the unity of the opposites. One thing that this helped me understand the dialectic and why it's such an interesting methodology. So one of the books that was really popular in Hegel's time before he wrote Phenomenology was an argument for skepticism by the philosopher Sextus Empiricus. And in that, he puts forward these 5 modes of skeptical thinking. These are great as basically tools you can use to disprove any claim made by someone. So just to go through them. So I put forward something that you should believe. Like let's say my belief is Donald Trump's going to be a bad president. So the mode of dispute is like, oh well, that could be wrong because there's more than one opinion, isn't there? So why should I trust your opinion over someone else's? The mode from deriving from relativity. It's like, yeah, that's your perception of Donald Trump, but you're just one person. So why should I trust your perception of that matter? There could be lots of other perceptions of Donald Trump. And then these 3 are really interesting though, because these are 3 modes that sort of point out that any belief you have is susceptible to being can be doubted just because of the problem of justifying belief. So these are the 3 different ways in which you can justify belief, and they're all problematic. So one way is just an infinite regress of justification. So you ask me why I think Donald Trump's going to be a bad president, and I say, oh, because he did a bad job in the economy. So I go, but why do you believe he did a bad job in the economy? Oh, because I looked at the statistics here, but why do you think those statistics are accurate? You just keep going down, down. And every belief is found on another belief, it's found on another belief, you never get to an end. Or I can start with a hypothetical mode. So I can just say, sorry, that's just a belief I have, and I can't question that belief. And I'm not going to question that belief. That isn't justified by anything, it's just an a priori thing I hold as a necessary belief. Which is also problematic, because it's like, well, why should I accept it then, right? So I can either do infinite regress, either I can just say, I'm starting at this starting point, don't question it, or I can justify that starting point with some sort of circular argument. So, you can think of dialectical thinking as, a way of, it's actually a way of going through a skeptical argument, of engaging in some sort of criticism of consciousness, which doesn't rely on any of these starting points, right? Because it doesn't, because it's not starting by making any positive claims for itself, right? The dialectical method is a way of thinking and critiquing without starting from anything other than this, the position of consciousness that you have. So it's a purely immanent critique. What that means is it allows you to engage in a critique of these different forms of consciousness without yourself having to come and say, oh, by the way, this is what I believe, to get started. So one way of looking at the dialectic is sort of is a way of this an extreme form of skeptical argument. But rather than it being a skepticism which is purely destructive, it produces a skepticism which is positive, at least according to Hegel. I think it's correct to say he would see Kant's claims for the category as basically being this one, right? Kant starts with this hypothetical thing, these are the categories that a priori you can't question. And Hegel still wants to be able to say, no, we can still, I still want to show that they're, I'm not satisfied with that, I want to show how they're actually right. Okay. So, for Hegel, Kant is still dogmatic because he can't explain the origins of categories. Whereas the dialectical approach avoids the dogmatism and challenges skepticism as it starts with no positive belief. And dialectical thinking always starts in the middle and works to critique out within the frame of that consciousness. And that's how it avoids any sort of foundational or dogmatic thinking. And I think, yeah, and as I said, those negative results are going to pass positive results. So it's a form of skepticism, but it's a form of skepticism that actually builds positive results, so you can actually still progress with it. Oh, okay. Did anyone else have any versions of the dialectic that would be helpful to share, or any questions about dialectic? No? Okay, good. Let's go through the introduction. Look, we have 40 minutes. This is going to be pretty straightforward, just reading through the introduction. So the key threat of philosophy, I'm not starting with the preface because here I'm following Hippolyte, who sort of says the preface is really most likely the last. So if we do a second part of the Hegel series, we probably end with the preface rather than start with it. And I think the introduction really does set up the whole project. So the key threat to philosophy is irrationalism. So either philosophy can show us how reason can reveal the truth, or we have to give up philosophy. And you can see that's that Humean Enlightenment challenge to Enlightenment in a way. And philosophy has to do more than merely tell us that we cannot know the truth. There is something, Hegel wants to argue in the introduction, there's something unphilosophical about the whole transcendental project, which suggests that before we can decide if we can use reason in the world, we have to consider whether we have a capacity to understand the world as it is in itself. So there's two key points in the introduction. The first key point of the introduction is to show that it's actually misguided to start a philosophical inquiry by determining the limits of our ability to know. So he's critiquing that Kantian transcendental gesture of saying, before we can understand reality, or before we can get started with that thing of developing knowledge, we first have to work out what are the actual limitations of knowledge and the limits of knowledge. And how is it that we know? And once we've determined the limits of knowledge, then we're ready to actually start with the understanding. The second key point is basically a justification of this dialectical method. So that it is legitimate to present an immanent critique of different types of knowing, and that knowing provides its own criteria, that you don't have to bring in your criteria for working out the truth of knowledge from somewhere other than knowledge itself. And once this is allowed, then you don't need that external criteria. A dialectical critique shows how knowledge is inconsistent according to its own criteria for correctness and allows for progress. But the key arguments. So let's get started. The introduction starts with Hegel's critique of the transcendental project. And he starts by saying that by treating cognition as a medium or an instrument to which to grasp the absolute, you're automatically seeing the world as something other than what we cognize. And that approach is always going to see the absolute as something alien to whatever we perceive or understand. And he says there's two ways of looking at this view. So one is, you could see cognition as an instrument. Now, if you're going to view cognition as an instrument to understand what's in the world, in which case we have to first of all say that, well, we're not then going to see the world as it is in itself, which is the basic Kantian position. But he claims that this is that identifying this instrument is actually a superfluous effort. Because if you don't have the truth, then if your instrument doesn't allow you to get to the truth, then how's it going to allow you to get to the truth about the categories that you've developed themselves? Like there's a sense in which if you don't have access to the truth, because everything is determined by this instrument by which you're perceiving things, then how can you assume that you've got some sort of truth about that instrument? Wouldn't the same sort of problem occur as you're trying to then explain what that instrument itself is? So pointing that out would be, he just says, a superfluous effort. What if you saw the instrument as bringing the world to us though as it is accurately? Well, then he says, that's fine, but then it would be difficult to see the point of this instrument. So if the instrument is something that deceives us about when we see the world, then we can't be sure about knowledge of what the instrument is anyway, and identifying it isn't going to help us understand what's really there, so why bother? It's not going to help us get to the truth. Okay, but let's assume the instrument is accurate. But if the instrument is accurate, again, there's really no point to that instrument, and there's no point to the instrument, and there's actually no point, again, pointing what the instrument is, pointing it out. And similarly, he says, well, what if it's just this medium through which we're perceiving the world? So it's not so much an instrument that's changing the world, but it's like this, it's a medium, like some sort of ways in which we're perceiving it. And again, he says, well, again, the point is not the medium. The point would be getting to what we see through that medium, the point of it. And then he points out, and science, which is like, and by science here, so Hegel used science to mean the term philosophy, but he also just means basically that project of getting ahead of finding understanding about the world. And he points out that science actually isn't bothered by those questions. And so if science isn't bothered by those questions, maybe we should actually mistrust the very mistrust in our cognitive faculties. Instead of starting from the transcendental project, for Hegel, that transcendental project, the very way you frame it means that you have some separation between the way we see the world and what the world is in itself. Why don't we, instead of doubting our cognitive faculties, just doubt the very doubt itself? Just get rid of that problem and just get on with science, right? So should we not be concerned that this fear of error is not just the error itself? And then this doubting itself is based on problematic assumptions. So this is his, and the doubting here is the doubting of our ability to know the truth. So to be specific, it takes for granted, that is the transcendental critique. It takes for granted certain ideas about cognition as an instrument and as a medium, and assumes there is a difference between ourselves and this cognition. Above all, it presupposes that the absolute stands on one side and cognition on the other, independent and separated from it, and yet is something real. Or in other words, it presupposes that cognition, which, since it is excluded from the absolute, is surely outside of the truth as well, is nevertheless true, an assumption whereby what calls itself fear of error reveals itself rather as a fear of the truth. And I think this is one of the most convincing parts of the introduction in terms of his argument against Kant. He says the problem with starting by testing the accuracy of our cognitive faculties is that this approach ends up making a distinction between truth for us and truth in itself. But that's just not what we mean by truth. When we use the word truth, we mean the absolute. We mean the truth independent of how we perceive things. So he can't be satisfied with his answer to the Kantian answer to the problem of, say, induction, which would say, or the problem of free will, which would just say, well, you can't see it, and we never will know it, and we just have to accept that. And except that there's this limitation in what we can understand. Because Hegel would say, but when we talk about truth, that's just not what we mean. We don't mean truth as relative to a particular way of understanding the world. We mean truth as absolute. And that's just something that is, I don't know, that's just a part of how, or what we mean by as we engage with that activity of trying to understand things about the world. And by the way, science does work. It actually does develop knowledge without going through that critique. And if you told a scientist, oh, but look, I've got this Kantian critique of what you're doing, and it shows that your knowledge is only relative or conditioned, it probably really would have bothered them too much. They could still do this activity of science without worrying about the critique. Then he makes this point, and he says, but if he did point out to science that it was wrong, however, then science would just seek to improve itself. It wouldn't give up. And so it would just mean that it would appear to science as not being completed. So science was liberating itself from the semblance, that is, if you point out that its understanding was wrong, but it can do so only by turning against it. I read that as turning against the semblance. So at the heart of science is already this idea that I need to get to the most accurate understanding of the world as possible. I don't need to understand the instruments to do that. That's just a part of what science is and what it does. And now it comes to the purpose of phenomenology of spirit. Now, because it has only phenomenal knowledge for its object, this exposition seems not to be a science, free and self-moving in its own peculiar shape. Yet from this standpoint, it can be regarded as the path of the natural consciousness which presses forward to true knowledge, whereas the way of the soul which journeys through a series of its own configurations as though there were stations appointed for it by its own nature, so that it may purify itself for the life of the spirit and achieve finally through a completed experience of itself the awareness of what it really is in itself. So the idea here seems to be, and this is what he's beginning to describe what's going to happen in this phenomenology of spirit, that it's not quite the same as science, but what he's going to do is look at how natural consciousness presses forward towards knowledge, towards truth. And he says it's almost like the way of a soul journeying through a series of its own configurations, as though there were stations. And I think like stations of the cross, I think it's a fair assumption to make what he's talking about there, appointed to it by its nature, so that it can purify itself for the life of the spirit, life of the mind, that reason operating through history in the world, so that the world's no longer alienated for the human being, so it can be free, and then through that, the awareness of what it really is in itself. So that's the beginning of what he's going to try to do through the phenomenology. Now, so the road that he's going to then chart is paved with errors, and he even calls it a pathway of doubt and more precisely the way of despair, which really emphasized the point I made earlier, that the dialectical process really is a skeptical exercise. And it's through these immanent critiques, what Hegel is going to do is show how these different shapes of consciousness are immanently problematic. That in their very attempts to grasp the world in some way or to change the world in some way, they produce effects that either to their understanding or to the world that they were not expecting, or which show the original project was problematic in some way. For what happens on it is not what is ordinarily understood when the word doubt is used, and he's very dismissive of this. Shilly-shallying about this or that presumed truth, followed by a return to that truth again after the doubt has been appropriately dispelled. So that at the end of the process, the matter is taken to be what it was in the first place. I don't know who he's referring to there, but he's referring to this type of philosophizing where you start with saying, oh, people think we should doubt this, but look, no, I can show that we shouldn't doubt it, therefore let's just keep believing it. He wants to distance himself from that sort of skeptical use of skepticism, or doubt, sorry. On the contrary, the path is the conscious insight into the untruth of phenomenal knowledge, for which supreme reality is what is in truth only the unrealized notion. Therefore, this thoroughgoing skepticism is also not the skepticism with which an earnest zeal for truth and science fancy that it has prepared and equipped itself to in their service. The resolve in science not to give oneself over to the thoughts of others upon mere authority, but to examine everything for oneself and follow only one's own conviction, or better still, to produce everything oneself and accept only one's own deed as what is true. Okay, so second line. So rather than it just being, so his point here is that this skepticism actually will show these problems with different types of knowledge, phenomenal knowledge along the way. And the unrealized notion that would be just that the correct, I don't know what I'm trying to say, the notion that where there's no longer that separation between the thing in itself and as it is for itself, for the subject. And this thoroughgoing skepticism is then not the skepticism. Yeah, his point here is that when we're engaging in science, a key point for science is that we don't just believe things based on mere authority, but we examine everything for oneself and one's own conviction. And he seems to be saying here is that it also goes beyond that. That it's not just a thing of I'm only going to believe something if I can prove it to myself. So he's there just making different distinctions between what his dialectical path of doubt is doing versus these other more, I guess, we would call common use of skepticism and doubt in philosophy. So, section 8, so we're going to continue. The series of configurations which consciousness goes through along the road is in reality the detailed history of the education of consciousness to the standpoint of science. And then the process of skepticism and doubt is a necessary condition of attaining knowledge that's not merely based on authority or blind acceptance of the opinion of others. So the skepticism that is directed against the whole range of phenomenal consciousness, on the other hand, renders the spirit for the first time competent to examine what truth is. So in section 79, then he gets to the point that this skepticism is not just negative. So that this necessary progression and interconnection of the forms of unreal consciousness will by itself bring to pass the completion of the series. And the idea in this section then seems to be that so this form of dialectical critique where we see these different forms of consciousness imminently critiqued, and so almost like changing just to overcome their own contradictions, will inevitably brings about a completion in a series. So to make this more intelligible, it may be remarked in a preliminary and general way that the exposition of the untrue consciousness in its untruth, that's a dialectical critique, is not merely a negative procedure. The natural consciousness itself normally takes this one-sided view of it, and a knowledge which makes this one-sidedness its very essence is itself one of the patterns of incomplete consciousness, which occurs on the road itself and which will manifest itself in due course. So he points out that even that view that, the view that what our quest for knowledge is hopeless, even that's going to be one of the views that he critiques during this process. This is just a skepticism which only ever sees pure nothingness in its result and abstracts from the fact that this nothingness is specifically the nothingness of that from which it results. For it is only when it is taken as the result of that from which it emerges that it is in fact the true result. In that case, it is itself a determinate nothingness, one which has a content. And his simple point here is that when you have that as a result of the dialectical critique, you come to see that a form of consciousness or a formal way of viewing the subject or the object is incorrect, you actually do have a type of knowledge there. That negative result lends itself to something positive. And in that negative result, there is actually a type of truth. So it's not just a senseless nothing. It's not this skeptical project isn't just a series of failures. These failures lead towards an ultimate success. There's a point to it, a completion to it. But
the goal for this phenomenological experience is as necessarily fixed for knowledge as the serial progression. It is the point where knowledge no longer needs to go beyond itself, where knowledge finds itself, where notion corresponds to object and object to notion. Consciousness, however, is explicitly the notion of itself. Hence, it is something that goes beyond limits. And since these limits are its own, it is something that goes beyond itself. So Hegel's claim here is that the goal of this progression, where you're going to have that ultimate agreement, or there's no longer going to be that tension, where the notion will agree with the in itself and the itself, the notion, the object of the notion, that's already fixed just because of what knowledge is. So whatever knowledge is, knowledge always wants to go beyond itself. It's something that inevitably wants to go beyond itself, because it has that goal as a part of what it is. Thus, consciousness suffers its violence at its own hands. It spoils its own limited satisfaction. When consciousness feels this violence, its anxiety may well make it retreat from the truth and strive to hold on to what it is in danger of losing. But it can find no peace. If it wishes to remain in a state of unthinking inertia, then thought troubles its thoughtlessness, and its own unrest disturbs its inertia. Or if it entrenches itself in sentimentality, which assures us that it finds everything to be good in its kind, then for this assurance likewise suffers violence at the hands of reason, for precisely insofar as something is merely a kind, reason finds it not to be good. So his point here, he's describing that because consciousness always seeks towards that, that end point of knowledge, it is always in a way going to be, it suffers violence at its own hands. It changes of its own accord according as it realizes the contradictions in its different positions. The point here, though, seems to be that when this dialectical, the changes that Hegel's going to be describing are descriptive changes. So you can sort of imagine two characters in the phenomenology spirit. One is this consciousness going, attempting to grasp the world subject in one way. And then there's going to be we, the philosophers, looking on and observing this consciousness. And it's not going to be the case that the philosopher is going to intervene and tell the consciousness, no, you're wrong there. Naughty, you have to think like this. Rather, it's going to be this consciousness itself is going to realize that it's wrong just because of what it's trying to do. And we're going to be like passively observing on the side, going, oh yeah, I can see how, you've made that mistake now. And his point here seems to be that I don't know how convincing this is, right? Because is it possible to be a consciousness and just to be happy with that you're living, that what you know is wrong, but that you're going to believe it anyway? Yeah. And so because here he seems to be saying, no, consciousness doesn't do that because it has a set goal. It's that there's always going to be this thoughtless, that this restlessness. It's constantly going to be disturbed from its inertia. But again, I don't know if what you're claiming here is some sort of historical reality, or if he's talking about a consciousness as an ideal thing, like this, as an example consciousness, like the one he's going to take us through, in the phenomenology of spirit. Okay. Then he asks this question: what is the criterion that the phenomenological method will use to determine if its examination of cognition is correct? And this is where he sort of sets out his methodology. And his point here is that consciousness always at once distinguishes itself from the object, but also from its own knowing. And those two things are always caught up with knowing. So when you ask the question of what is knowledge, knowledge is never only knowledge of an object. It's also knowledge of my knowledge of that object. And so knowledge is so when he says it's an in itself, that's a for itself, it's just that idea that you can't really, any sort of type of, you're talking about knowledge, you're also talking about something that is that has that self-conscious structure to it. And you can't talk about knowledge just as being knowledge of an object. And because of that, consciousness provides its own criteria from within itself so that the investigation becomes a comparison of consciousness within itself. For the distinction made above falls within it. That is, the distinction between what I know and what I know of what I know are both a part of that conscious experience. And because of that self-awareness of knowing, consciousness is able to provide its own criterion of whether or not it's accurate. Because it's always able to ask whether what I know is actually correct. But the essential point to bear in mind throughout the whole investigation is that these two moments, notion and object, being for another and being in itself, both fall within that knowledge which we are investigating. Consequently, we do not need to import criteria or to make use of our own bright ideas and thoughts during the course of the inquiry. It is precisely when we leave these aside that we succeed in contemplating the matter in hand, in and for itself. And again, the point being, you're not going to have this philosopher bring in their own criteria showing why this consciousness is incorrect. You're rather going to have that consciousness is going to be able to use consciousness in the way in which you're trying to understand knowledge and make that notion correspond to the object, already contains within itself the criteria which it will use to judge itself. Pointing out there that the dialectical critique is an immanent critique. It's not bringing its own criteria to show why this particular belief is wrong. Yes. That use of the dialectical method, though, I just find it so the reason I find it so fascinating is because it's a way of critiquing which avoids that whole problem of relativism. It avoids the whole problem of, but you only think that's wrong because you're looking at it from your perspective, or your point of view, or your belief system. Because the point of dialectical critique, ideally, when it works, is just going to be, no, this is wrong according to its own criteria. You've set up this way of looking at the world. In doing so, you're also establishing certain criteria for how you should look at the world. And according to your own criteria, you fail. There's this immanent critique working through the dialectic, which I just find so fascinating. It's, in a way, it's a way of critiquing which shouldn't involve bringing my own prejudices, ideas, opinions to bear. It's like, no, just imagine there's this consciousness. This consciousness conceives things like this. Now let's just look what happens when it does that and observe it and see what happens. And what you'll find is it ends up in contradicting itself in a way that that it wasn't apparent from its initial starting point. And this is part of what makes Phenomenology of Spirit so fascinating to read. Like when I read it for the first time, like last year, and there's parts where, getting personal, but like when I read The Unhappy Consciousness, I read through that and I'm like, oh my goodness, this is like my whole young adult life here. This is basically how I saw things. This was me. So you have these moments where you go, oh yeah, I recognize that structure. I recognize that way of looking at the world. And then to have that pulled apart in this way that it's not like, oh well, you're wrong because I come from this position. It's like, no, you're wrong because the very position that you're starting with is contradicting itself. It can't stand up to its own. It's going to just be on its own, based on its own problematics, it's going to want to change. And when you come up and I find that part of this whole method really just fascinating. And one of the parts that makes the text so interesting is you go through these different forms of consciousness and looking and going through that constant experience of these different forms of trying to grasp the world, set up these artificial positions. And they're always problematic in some way. And sometimes the contradiction comes about just because of the way the initial categories are set up. Sometimes the contradiction comes about because I have this idea and I'm going to put this into the world, and then when I put it into the world, suddenly the opposite happens. consequence. Like the contradiction is that I couldn't control or foresee all the results of the project that was to come about. Anyway, so then this is in section 585, he talks about this concept of looking on. But not only is a contribution by us superfluous, since notion and object, the criterion, and what is to be tested are present in consciousness itself, but we are also spared the trouble of comparing the two and really testing them, so that since what consciousness examines is its own self, all that is left for us to do is simply to look on. So when he uses this collective we, you can imagine that as that's like the philosopher here that is going to be passively looking on as his consciousness develops through the course of the text. For consciousness is, on the one hand, consciousness of the object, and on the other, consciousness of itself. Consciousness of what for it is the true, and consciousness of its knowledge of the truth. Since both are for the same consciousness, this consciousness is itself their comparison. It is for the same consciousness to know whether its knowledge of the object corresponds to the object or not. The object, it is true, seems only to be for consciousness in the way that consciousness knows it. It seems that consciousness cannot, as it were, get behind the object as it exists for consciousness so as to examine what the object is in itself, and hence too cannot test its own knowledge by that standard. But the distinction between the in itself and knowledge is already present in the very fact that consciousness knows an object at all. Something is for it, the in itself, and that's the knowledge, the object of consciousness. So a simple way to unpack that argument, the way I describe it, yes, we have, when I have a consciousness of something, part of that consciousness is that I don't completely understand that, or I don't see all of that. And Hegel's point is that exactly. So in your own grasping of things automatically, it's not just that you have a certain belief and that belief just sort of exists in a way that isn't aware of itself as a belief. When I see an object or I try to understand something, part of what I'm always going to see as the object is that I don't completely understand it. And that's going to be a part of what that knowledge is, and that's how consciousness, in a way, sets up its own criteria for always wanting to push forward and seek after that absolute knowing. And just in that very act of trying to understand anything at all. So the point there being that, and again, that criteria is in consciousness. It's not something that's going to be contributed by the philosopher who's going to be looking on as this phenomenological, as we watch the phenomenology, the consciousness develop through these different stages. So, trying to simplify, but perhaps just confusing more. The distinction between the phenomenal and the noumenal is itself phenomenal. As we perceive, our phenomenal understanding is falling short. Not only does our understanding of the object change, but also the criteria by which whether or not we have the truth changes. So the relationship between testing what we know and testing the criterion of what knowing is cannot be separated. Knowing is always testing our knowledge of the object and testing the criteria of what knowing is. It's never just a straight knowledge of the object. I feel like Kant put that clearer than I did though, so I'm just going to move on. So then we have three more sections. Section 86. So inasmuch as the, inasmuch as the new true object, issues from it, I think, this dialectical movement which consciousness exercises on itself and which affects both its knowledge and its object is precisely what is called experience. So, already got through that. So the true, as he defines it here, is the being for consciousness of this in itself, or in other words, this is the essence or the object of consciousnness. This new object contains the nothingness of the first, is what experience has made for it. And the point being there that as we move towards the truth, part of the truth of the object will be the failures of the previous understandings of what that object is. The new object contains the nothingness of the first object. That's what experience makes it as it works through. Okay, 87 shows up here like this. Since what first appears as the object sinks for consciousness to the level of its way of knowing it, and since the in itself becomes a being for consciousness of the in itself, the latter is now the new object. Herewith, a new pattern of consciousness comes on the scene as well, for which the essence is something different from what it was at the preceding stage. It is this fact that guides the entire series of patterns of consciousness in their necessary sequence. But it is just this necessity itself, or the origination of the new object that presents itself to consciousness without its understanding how this happens, which proceeds for us, as it were, behind the back of consciousness. Thus, in the movement of consciousness, there occurs a moment of being in itself and being for us, which is not present to the consciousness comprehended in the experience of itself. And the point he's making there is just that there's a point to looking on. So even though this consciousness is going to be going through these patterns and changing in this necessary sequence which we can observe, still the process by which that's happening is not going to be completely visible to that consciousness. And that, because otherwise there'd be no point around the phenomenology. Right? The phenomenology, though, is going to show us where, and the philosophers looking on are going to show us the things that the consciousness can't perceive for itself and what's causing its the changes to itself. Yes. So section 88 is one sentence. Because of this necessity, the way to science is itself already science, and hence in virtue of its content is the science of the experience of consciousness. And the science of the experience of consciousness is just the knowledge of the way that consciousness experiences things and changes over time. That's just, of course, what the phenomenology of spirit is going to be exploring. And here's the last section. So the experience of itself, which consciousness goes through, can, in accordance with its notion, comprehend nothing less than the entire system of consciousness or the entire realm of the truth of spirit. For this reason, the moments of this truth are exhibited in their own proper determinateness, viz. As being not abstract moments, but as they are for consciousness, whereas consciousness itself stands forth in its relation to them. Thus, the moments of the whole are patterns of consciousness. In pressing forward to its true existence, consciousness will arrive at a point at which it gets rid of its semblance of being burdened with something alien, with what is only for it, and some sort of other, at a point where appearance becomes identical with essence, so that its exposition will coincide at just this point with the authentic science of spirit. And finally, when consciousness itself grasps this, its own essence, it will signify the nature of absolute knowledge itself. So that's him just pointing towards the project of what we're about to read in the book. So what we're going to see is patterns of consciousness, and because we're going to be observing them as a philosopher, we're going to see how consciousness itself will work through these many stages of trying to grapple with that relationship between the subject and the object, the for itself and the in itself, until it arrives at the point where there's no longer a absolute knowledge, where those two are no longer in conflict with one another. That was the introduction. Basically, taken through section by section. It's 11:56, so I'm going to end the session. But I'm definitely going to stay behind. And if anyone has any questions or wants further discussion, that would be great. Next week, our goal is to get through the section on consciousness. And it's completely, yeah. So if you wanted to read that section beforehand or read it after, I think either works well. But you can expect something similar here. It's just going to be, not as much detail because the introduction is quite short, but my goal will be to unpack the basic arguments of the consciousness section so that you can get an idea of what are the main points, the main ideas that are in that section. Yes. Otherwise, thank you, everybody. And I said we'll be on again next Saturday at the same time.